Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of the Offset Podcast. And today we're continuing on with our discussion with three industry experts about the state of monitors in 2025. Stay tuned.
This podcast is sponsored by Flanders Scientific, leaders in color-accurate display solutions for professional video. Whether you're a colorist, an editor, a DIT, or a broadcast engineer, Flanders Scientific has a professional display solution to meet your needs. Learn more at flandersscientific.com.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Offset Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Robbie Carmen, and with me, as always, is Joey Dana. Hey, Joey, how are you, man?
Hi, everyone.
We are continuing our discussion today with three of our pals and industry experts, Bram Desmond from FSI, Nate McFarland from Dolby, and David Abrams from Abacow/Portrait Displays. And in part one, if you missed that, be sure to go back and check that out. We kind of just talked a little brief overview. I shouldn't say brief, a overview of kind of the roles that these guys play in various parts of the display industry. But we thought, guys, in part two here, we would pepper you with some questions that have been on our minds, have been on some of our audience minds, and Joey and I spent a lot of time on forums and user groups and colors groups and stuff. And so some of these questions that we're going to pepper you with also come from that source. But guys, I want to start out with something that we get asked about a lot, and I can answer like in a very dumb way, and that is, how are panels actually made, right? Because I think that it's a dark hole, a black hole, I think, of knowledge for a lot of people about how these displays are made. Because it's like, oh, cool, new display. Where'd that come from? No idea, right? From your guys' perspective, and let's start with you, Bram, because you probably deal with a lot of this on a day-to-day basis with FSI. Like, where do these panels come from? How are they made? And is it a super uber technical process, or is it something that is kind of standard throughout the industry? Just speak to a little bit to how that manufacturing happens.
Yeah. So the number one requirement for making panels is to have more money than anybody would ever know what to do with. The thing that I always point to as kind of a reality check for people because one thing that we get asked all the time is, why don't you make your own panels that go into the panel? And it's like, well, because I don't have billions of dollars sitting around, and that's not hyperbole. So sorry. So you are literally like SDC's quantum dot OLED facility. To give you an idea, the capital investment earmarked for that is about $10 billion US.
Oh, Trump change, yeah.
So this is why there are only a handful of large panel manufacturers. This is why you see this adopted by lots of different TV manufacturers and monitor manufacturers, and why you see so much shared technology, which isn't a bad thing. It's a good thing, because you can only make these things with that sort of scale. Even small pilot lines to make prototypes of stuff. I mean, you're looking at places where they might be spending $500 million just to get a pilot line up and running. So there are some exceptions where, research departments at universities will do material science type stuff and make small batch panels, but that is really more the exception than the rule. The rule is more that these are very, very large semiconductor manufacturers with extensive IP, extensive manufacturing facilities. And it's also why you see them kind of try to milk it a little bit in terms of keeping a plant up and running for years and years and years, even when the technology is kind of deprecated, and why you see kind of this filtering down in the industry of technology that once was high end is now more the entry level, and why they keep manufacturing it is because they've spent all that money and they need to recoup that cost. If you look at some of these factories, this is not a simple thing. A lot of this is like automated clean rooms. You're looking at a lot of these panel substrates are garage door size or larger. They look like the side of a house, and then they're cut down. So these are and the size capacity, like how big they can make that underlying glass essentially, is what in large part determines the generations. So you'll hear these Gen 8, Gen 8.5, like what the heck does that mean? A lot of it comes down to the size of the substrates that they can make. But they're really impressive facilities. If you ever, get to see a video, they don't typically allow people to tour them. They're pretty
Yeah.
strict about that.
Yeah.
But if you see videos of how these made giant machines picking up these pieces of glass, moving them around, a lot of clean room operations, and a lot of material science development has to go into this. And these people, semiconductor manufacturers work with suppliers like Nanosys and whatever to get quantum dot materials, or different LED manufacturers for backlights. So it's a very sophisticated process that typically only very big companies with extremely deep pockets bother to get into, because it's very hard for anybody small to try to get into the space.
Yeah, it's funny. I always say that like the biggest advances in technology always can be kind of narrowed down to material science.
Yep.
Once the material science is handled, everything else kind of, I won't say falls into place, but the material science of some of this stuff is incredibly advanced.
It is,
Yeah.
once they nail it, that's usually the hard part. Except that a lot of times they nail it, and then there's fights about IP. People sue other people, and technologies never come out. I've been witness to that several times in my career, where I was really excited about the evolution of a new display technology, new material science that was going to go into a display. And then because one company, another company, it never found its way to the market. So a lot of disappointment.
I always keep my little vial of quantum dots here.
There you go. I love it.
Now, so I think another question that related to that is that I think there is this idea that a company like FSI or LG or whoever, right? Like there's I think there's confusion about, like, especially like LG and Samsung come to mind because they're the two ones that I see cited the most, that like the TV side of that company is the same thing as the display manufacturing side of that company. That's not really true, right? In a lot of cases.
Same parent company typically, but yeah, the consumer electronics side of these companies and the semiconductor side of these companies are typically pretty well siloed, and that part of that is because again, they have to spend so much money to build these factories that a lot of times selling to just their own consumer electronics division will never offset that cost. They'll never recoup it. They'll never profit. So they have to sell to a lot of other manufacturers, So yeah, these are very separate entities. And amusingly, a lot of times you see them, you'll see, the consumer electronics side of the company buy from the competitor of the semiconductor side of that company.
Like that doesn't make any sense, right?
They have to meet certain consumer electronics demands. And funnily enough, sometimes you see that, what the semiconductor manufacturers produce sometimes will find its way into consumer electronics partners from competing companies well before the consumer electronics side of that same company adopts their own technology. So yeah, it's really funny sometimes to see those dynamics between those large companies, but they are typically very separate entities, and that's something that causes a lot of confusion because people are like, "Oh, you get your panels from Samsung," and I've literally had customers come to me and go, "Oh, so you're just taking apart a Samsung TV, pulling the panel from that, and putting it in?" It's like, no, that's not what we're doing. So we buy the panels from like someone like SDC, just like a Samsung or a Sony or whoever would buy that same panel. So that is, just to be clear about that, those entities operate very separately.
No, it's a confusing thing. So thanks for clarifying that. Speaking of confusing things, I want to get into some technical things for all three of you because I think there's a lot of opinion, there's a lot of fact, there's a lot of confusion around all these things. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the idea of some of the things that impact monitor performance, for lack of a better term. And what I mean by that is that I think there's, as colorists, we're used to working in a dark room, and we understand kind of the implications of ambient light and that kind of stuff. But like how important is viewing conditions and some other parts of like the viewing process important to like kind of, I don't know, lack of a better term, successful viewing or accurate viewing? Like things like, I'm thinking of things like backlights. I'm thinking of things like, actual, hitting, 100 nits for SDR or whatever for HDR. Like how dramatic are some of those things to overall performance of a display? If that makes sense?
Yeah, I think Nate can definitely talk on that quite well, because I talked to Nate about viewing environment. It's probably the thing we've talked about more than anything over the last year, to be honest. So I know that ambient light is a huge factor. Viewing environment's a huge factor. I know David also deals with this a lot in terms of the difference between what he sees on his more consumer install type situations versus professional installations.
Yeah, I'll give you a great example, right? One thing that comes up often in a lot of the forums that I'm on, people talk about backlights, right? And they go, all right, well, I'll just go and I'll get a backlight and I'll just pop it on there. And there doesn't seem to be any consideration for where that backlight's going, how bright it should be, what the rest of the lights look like in the room. So I'm just curious from your guys' perspective, because you walk into any given suite and it's a totally different lighting situation, a totally different environment than another suite, and how much that goes into just our observation of the display.
This is a really good question, Robbie, and this is as Bram alluded to, this is probably one of the most common questions we get. I think in an ideal world, we would all do our grading in a 10 by 10, completely blacked out with bias light, exactly following the SMPTE specs for whatever you're doing. But the reality is that that's not the case, right? And it's not just an ambient light variation. Obviously, everybody sees things differently. Everybody's eyeballs are differently, but things as simple as reflections, texture of the wall, color of the wall, like these all, I mean, I've been in cinemas where the entire every seat in the cinema is red, right? So that casts like a red, so there's a ton of variability here. And I think that the thing that makes it even more complicated is that it's not the same for SDR and HDR, right? And when you start talking about bias lightings, then you get into discussions of things that you've already discussed, right? Where do you put it on the display? How bright do you have it? How do you measure how bright this is? Like these are all very great questions. And I think in a perfect world, Cerence body like SMPTE or ITU would just, go ahead and update that and give more concrete guidelines. But we've at Dolby been looking at this a lot recently. We're actually planning on talking about this more in our webinar after NAB for more kind of like specific recommendations.
Sure.
But long story short, it plays a massive role. I would actually argue, and Bram and David, I'm sure would agree, is that when you're working with lower luminance scenes, this becomes imperatively important because your eye is a lot more sensitive down in that region to any sort of minute details and changes that happen in the environment. So yeah, very, very important. And
now,
something
I'm curious, David, when you walk into a customer site, whether it be somebody with a really fancy home theater or one of like a top Hollywood studio, how often do you find yourself making viewing environment recommendation and changes before you even start talking about calibrating a display, right? Because if the viewing environment is completely wackadoodle, all your calibration work could go out the window.
Yeah, so a couple things there. So a lot of the customers that are having us calibrate, say, a bay, have already they're savvy, right? They know, hey, I'm color grading. I know a bit about this. I know enough to call a calibrator, maybe use a reference monitor. So those customers pretty much have a room that's at least darkened, right? Maybe the walls aren't painted black or have gray, but they've darkened the room. They've minimized their reflections. They've got their ideal seating position. And typically they do have a bias light.
Okay.
So not always, but typically they do. I would say more often than not, those customers have a bias light already there. And then once you move into like the consumer, right, the content consumer, and you're in these homes and you're in these theaters and you're in these rooms, most people that are hiring a professional calibrator will have some form of shades. I'd say, well over 90%, right? Is going to have some form of shades, room darkening, so they can enjoy their movies during the day and they can do those types of things. But those rooms are also not perfect. And they might have some light leakage. They might have a little bit of reflection. They might have a customer just might like watching with a little bit of light on, right? We've talked to customers.
Yeah, that was going to be kind of my next question: is how much butting heads do you get into with like, I like it this way? Well, that is not really right.
Well,
okay.
yeah,
I mean, where do you kind of draw the line?
Yeah, and to riff on that, sorry to interrupt, Joey, but to riff on that, well, I'm curious, like somebody like you, David, who does this professionally, do you have like a panic attack when you see like home theater groups and people with like hue light systems and they're constantly changing the like the light, you know, based on what's on screen? Does that like send you into the shakes?
I mean, if they were going to have me sit there and watch a movie, maybe, but
Yeah.
you know, if I'm just coming in, calibrating and leaving, like it's, hey, you know, to each their own.
It's your space, right?
Yeah. What's important to note is a calibrator is that um, the calibration of monitor with the probe, right? Your meter doesn't change because of the ambient light. And what I mean by that is you really don't want ambient lighting because the probe doesn't know the difference between the ambient light in the room and the light coming off the TV. So then you're taking that into account and you're making adjustments on the TV for what's happening in the room. And you don't want that. So when you calibrate, you really do want the room as dark as possible so there's as least contamination as possible. But then if you do have a user that is watching with higher light, well, would you calibrate to 100 nits in 709? Would you still do, you know, a 2.4 EOTF? This is a question that I don't think, and Bram and Nate can correct me, I don't think there's any standard of if you measure this much lux in the room, adjust the EOTF to be a 2.35 and the luminance to go to 140. Now, there are some research documents that have been done recently where people have done some perceptual modeling and saying in these type of environments, you might want to do this, but I don't think any of that's been standardized. So as a calibrator, you have to sort of make these decisions and figure out how do I get my customer something that's as true to the artist's intent as I can in the environment that they're in. Because a home user typically isn't going to take a living room and say, I'm going to now paint it black and the ceiling black and the walls this, and especially if they've got significant others that might not have the same decor preference.
Yes.
You know, the what do they call the wife acceptance factor? But
I like that.
so, you know, you have to kind of deal. Yeah, that's a big thing on the forums. They call it the wife acceptance factor. Like, how can you design the room for your theater?
Your guys partners and spouses don't like just like break out, you know, CIE diagrams when you're watching TV? I mean, what's up?
Yeah.
That's weird. No, I understand.
I would say there's one thing he said there is really important, I think, to differentiate is this idea of separation between preference and accuracy, because that's like at the heart of all these discussions, right? And that's why, at least from Dolby's perspective, like on any of our playback devices, you always see more than one Dolby Vision picture mode, right? Because if you were to go into the reference or most accurate picture mode in a super, you know, blind
too dim or whatever,
you'd be able to say like, I can't see anything, right? So I think that's really hard to juggle because, like David said, like there's no sort of one size fits all, and you can kind of, you know, skirt around this with things like ambient light sensors and things like that to get it. But then ultimately, like Joey was saying, like all of this could just be for naught because you could just have somebody who likes to, you know, vivid mode exists. Like people watch it, right? Like they like to blast their eyes.
I see this interesting dichotomy that is in play though, right? Is that so the monitors have gotten better, the standards are more well known, and it's like companies like Dolby, like you guys are assisting people in kind of trying to get the more accuracy, right? Like, you know, with the, you know, your certifications, your different modes, but like it also seems like these two things are a little bit at loggerheads, right? Because we have things like filmmaker mode and reference mode and all that kind of stuff.
100%.
But at the same time, like that's just the TV. We're not really speaking to the rest of the viewing environment with there. And it seems like it could be a little bit of a case where like of disappointment, right? Somebody turns on filmmaker mode and it's 100 nits, you know, and Gamma 2.4 and they're watching
too dim.
It's too dim. They go, well, this filmmaker mode's crap, right? When in reality,
what was this filmmaker thinking?
Right. In reality, that's probably the most accurate mode, but it still doesn't look good to them. So I guess a follow-up to this is I understand the reference environment, but on the consumer side of things, like how much variance or tolerance is there to, you know, a little above or below whatever the kind of the standard is? Like and David, you probably deal with this all the time, right? Like, is there a difference between, hey, this is accurate and this is what looks great in this room, if that makes sense?
You know, it's not exact yet, right? There's no like guide where I can walk in, make a measurement and say, the specification says I need to now do this because of this is your environment. A little bit of that does come from your intuition and your understanding of human perception as a calibrator and the type of room that you're in. Ultimately, as Nate was saying, with a personal preference, you know, you want to make your customer happy. So there's a lot you can do, even if you're not hitting that 100 nits 709 240 OTF perfectly, and that's, you can turn off a lot of the sharpening, right? You can make sure your image processing for like 2.3 pull down and everything is optimized. You can set up all your sources and make sure those sources are set up properly through, maybe there's an AV receiver and there's the TV.
Right.
You can calibrate that white balance so it is hitting D65, even if you're putting out 150 nits, right, or 175 nits off the screen. So there's still a lot you can do to say, I'm getting this a lot more accurate, and then I'm going to take it from there and sort of make a shift for the room environment. One of the things I'll ask a customer when I show up and I'm at their home is, hey, is this the mode you've been watching it in? How do you feel the brightness is? Because I can take a quick measurement of the mode they're in. Maybe it's vivid mode, but I can take a measurement. If it's 250 nits, they go, oh, I love how bright it is. I wish it was brighter. Then I know, okay, this guy's got a preference for really bright images. And maybe that means I need to explain to them, this is a little overkill for what you're watching, and depending on the room. But it's variable. I wish I could tell you and I keep pushing
So it's I get to say my favorite expression, how much is a boat?
Right, exactly.
One other thing that we've seen drastically change in both the consumer landscape and the professional display landscape is the available sizes, right? For years, for most of my career, 20 to 25 inch reference monitor was where we were living. Every so often, you had the big. We had the big 32 inch BVM because we thought we were hot stuff.
Yeah, I did.
But a 32 inch BVM was gigantic, right? To have a 32 inch reference monitor back in the day was like absurdly huge, and the big screen was something that was really, only existed in the home. Once larger CRTs started coming out, and more importantly, big flat panels started to come out. Now we're starting to see people, especially because there's the technology that's available now, reference monitors in these bigger 55 inch, 40 inch, 65 inch sizes. Whereas, I've always kind of, your default when you go into a grading suite is like, oh, you got a 55 inch, that's the client monitor. It's almost as good. But I'm looking at my 25 inch reference monitor, and now I've moved up to a 32 inch reference monitor, which my personal preference is I love the 32 inch size and this kind of distance to it. That is like my sweet spot. I know Robbie's rocking the 55 inch. And he likes that better than the 32 inch. How much are you guys seeing in the professional world? Are colorists accepting these bigger monitors, or are they kind of looking at them like, oh, that's just a client monitor, or it's too big for me to grade on. I'd rather be closer to a smaller one. Are we seeing that? Like, what's that landscape look like these days? I know my opinion on it, but I'm curious what other people in the business are doing.
Yeah.
I can speak to that a little bit. So we actually talked about this in a webinar last year. I think there's pros and cons for each, what I would call like a one or a dual display setup. I think from an education standpoint, showing folks for the first time the differences, like there's always going to be the necessity of viewing them side by side. But I think when I've started to talk to more and more colorists, I think they're starting to consider going down to that one display now that the bigger sizes are more readily available and acceptable. Wearing my engineer like scientist hat, I would say that, sticking with the same size that, the average person at home would also be watching it on, and more in some cases, even the same panel technology, right? Like there's, a plethora of benefits for doing that. I also am a big fan of, when you are doing a dual display setup, you kind of, we were just speaking about bias lighting and how the standards are different between SDR and HDR. Like, how do you make that call, right? If you want to view both at the same time, like, do you average out the ambient light, or like, you know what I mean? Like, so that's a tough discussion to have. I think I'm seeing it's probably still like a 50-50 from the people that I talk to that like to do dual versus single. But I think that, again, like the XMP lineup and stuff, I think has opened a lot of people's eyes to the possibilities. I will say too, like that you cannot articulate the difference of perception when it goes to different screen sizes. Like an example I always like to tell people is like, if I bring you into my Dolby Cinema in New York and show you 108 nits full blast, you'd be thinking you're looking at like a 10,000 nits at least, just because it's huge, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the biggest change for me, having Joey mentioned that I'm now generally prefer larger format monitors to the smaller format monitors. I'm actually doing, the whole idea of like, it used to be like audio mixers would take the, the mix and go to the car to listen to it on that other set of speakers.
Yeah.
I'm actually doing that kind of in a sense, but I'm going to a smaller monitor to test the translatability of my grade from the bigger monitor because of that perceptual difference, right?
Sure.
Like I have like a permanent setup where I have an iPad Pro that I'm also monitoring on at the same time that I'm looking at the big display because of that perceptual difference, right? It is weird.
Yeah.
It is weird how that perception can really, that size can really change things.
Well, I'd almost like want to put it back on you then, Robbie, too, from like just a practical standpoint. Like, do you find that the going to the bigger size is a lot more like natural for like client interaction and stuff like that? Because that was always
I do. So I think there's several benefits to this. One, I think that the single display in the room gets rid of that age-old problem of where am I supposed to be looking, how I should be looking, especially when they're different display technologies. It's like just eliminates that as a variable, right? I also think unscientifically, I'm really tied into the idea of trying to replicate the home viewing experience-ish a little bit, right? In terms of size, distance, sitting on the couch, etc. Like I see a lot of benefits to that. And then third, I would just say that from a client confidence point of view, it's always seemed to me that they know that the small monitor on the desk has traditionally been better. So they don't actually trust what they're seeing in front of them as much as like clients think there's some game being played, right? So I think that when you have like, oh no, we're just looking at this one monitor, there's a psychological thing that's happening on there where it's like, oh no, the colorist is looking at the same monitor. That must be the accurate one, kind of thing that's in play. And I think that, my ideal situation, maybe one of these days we'll get that. I would love, I think for me in the rooms that I work in, a 77 or an 83-inch size panel would rule them all, right? If I could just
ergonomically, because that's where I get caught up is for me to be comfortable with the 55-inch side, it's got to be a little bit further back ergonomically, and then it takes up more physical space than I have in the suite. Whereas with the 32, I'm the exact right distance from it. That like huge enough size where you can just set your distance from it where it needs to be. That would probably
it becomes more like a grading theater at that point in time, right? So
exactly, and I kind of love that idea.
Yeah, where I think it's good. Okay, so David, as a calibrator, and we talked about in our previous episode, kind of the challenges of reference calibration gear versus more consumer gear. One of the things that you mentioned, and I think is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking of about, but I don't have all the answers, so I'm curious what you say. You mentioned earlier the idea of, hey, we're going to profile this display using the Spectro to build a correction matrix or whatever for the colorimeter. That process has always kind of seemed like a pain in the ass to me, to be honest with you, right? Like I get what it does and I understand what we're doing to kind of profile the meter, but like it just seems antiquated. We're taking white, red, green, blue, and white, and then we're okay with matte. Like, is there something better, I guess is what I'm asking. And where do you see that kind of improving for the end user? Because it just seems like, yeah, okay, I can do this the right way, but it's a whole lot of steps to get right. I got to do this for every single display. What role or what changes do you see potentially happening with that? How that kind of operation works?
Yeah, this is a fight. I think every person who's calibrating, especially if you're calibrating a lot of displays, we end up having these thoughts. I would love to just have a spectroradiometer that can measure any type of display, doesn't need a correction to it, right? You take it out, measure, do my job, and move on. If I'm doing something like a digital cinema projector where you do what's called an MCGD, right? Measured color gamut data. You measure red, green, blue, and white typically. You tell it your target and then you validate it. Not a lot of measurements, right? So building the meter profile might take longer than actually just doing the calibration with the spectroradiometer. So we often see in those markets, right, in the cinema markets, that those customers are only using spectroradiometers because they don't need to make thousands of measurements and do this. When you start to get to those correction tables we talk about for colorimeters, right, to make a colorimeter have the same measurement as the spectro on that display technology, a lot of things come into that. When you're making that meter profile, you want to make sure the display is in as native as a state as you can. Right. So if you have a display that's say P3, but you're correcting it to 709, making your profile, well, there's actually blue and red in green to bring that green in. Right. So now you're making a profile with some contamination of the channels. Typically, what I've personally found is if I'm building a meter matrix for 709 on a display and doing 709, it doesn't matter if I have a little contamination, but if I go to a different target and I made it in 709 with some contamination, I get an error. So the process of warming up the display, putting in that native state, making sure it's in a stable state, right? You don't want to do a profile usually at 2000 nits because the display itself will fluctuate during the meter profile.
Right.
Does take time, but you get the gain on the measurement speed and you get the gain on the sensitivity side because a colorimeter is going to measure faster than most spectroradiometers. It's going to be able to measure lower than most spectroradiometers. So if you have those displays that need really close to black, it does end up being worth the time to do it. So does that answer?
No, it does. It does.
Let me expound on that one with one other question, because I've heard mixed things about this. Is there any value to doing any kind of volumetric profiling of the colorimeter, as in doing ramps as opposed to just primaries?
I can on that if you like.
Sure. Brom's done a lot of research on this.
So yeah, I think the added value of volumetric profiling for colorimeters, which is something that you'll find in various ways, right? So you have simpler systems that break down just into a few extra readings and a few divisions. So you have something like the Bodner method, which is built into Kalman. Then you also have like the multi-point volumetric profiling that's for colorimeters is built into software like ColorSpace. Some of that probably from me bugging Steve over the years to add something like that. And the desire for something like that and the desire for methods like the Bodner method are more to deal with displays that are non-additive. So if you have an additive display that is red, green, blue additive for white, four-color matrix method, which is the NIST kind of official approach for colorimeter calibration, it tends to work really well. We've done a lot of side-by-side testing with volumetric profiling, Bodner for four-color matrix method, and there's really very little gain to doing anything more complex as long as your display is additive. Now, when you get to non-additive display technologies like WOLED specifically, there can be some measurable significant improvements. Now, how much does it matter? If you're doing a consumer TV and a consumer install, I'm not sure that the gain is all that much. If you're doing it for a colorist, maybe there is some real value in exploring these other methods. But my personal opinion on this is that you don't need anything greater than this as long as your display is additive. Now, the other thing that I think goes into some of the questions you were asking earlier is, this necessity to have a spectro and a colorimeter. That's going to be hard to ever get around. You have devices already that exist that kind of combine a colorimeter and a spectro in a single device. You also have very high-end spectras, but ultimately you're looking at a physics problem here, right? And this is not something that's easy to solve with new technology, because with a spectroradiometer, the issue is you only have so many photons going in, and you got to split them up over diffraction grading, as opposed to something that just has 3 photodiodes in it with filters on top of it. So that's collecting a lot more photons, which is why it measures so much faster, why it measures so much better into low lights, because it doesn't need as many photons, it's not splitting up those photons kind of inefficiently through diffraction grading. And then if you have a combined device, which have existed for a long time, Photo Research had this many, many years ago, and there are other companies that do it, where you have something like a beam split that splits the light between a colorimeter section and a spectro section. The problem there, again, is the same thing, right? You're splitting that light. And so with very little light and you're steering the photons one way or another, that's why all of this is necessary in the first place, right? So it's not something that's going to be easy to solve on a technology level because it's ultimately a physics problem, which I know Joey is a big physics fan.
Well, I can deal with the 4-color method in the time. I just really want wireless meters, but that's a talk for another day. Completely wireless. I hate cables, so the more wireless we can get the better. All right, one last big subject, and we'll wrap up. Is just I have a few consumer questions that have popped up, or consumer related questions, and I think you guys are experts in this, so I'm curious your thoughts. I think we've seen this merging of, I think generically you could call prosumer, right? It's somewhere between, and maybe it's not perfect reference, but it's not consumer, it's really good. And we've seen a lot of people, I feel, I really like recall this happening with the WOLEDs and LG became LG kind of became like a Kleenex tissue kind of conversation, right? Where it's like, it's just like, oh, well, we have an LG in the front of the room kind of thing. That merging of consumer and pro kind of, using consumer panels in pro situations, I think is here to stay. But I'm guessing it has a lot of challenges from, connectivity, SDI versus say HDMI or USB-C. There's some of the calibration stuff that we spoke about in part 1 where consumer companies simply don't have enough time to really do a thorough job on some of these and set up. What are we not thinking about? What are the impacts of using consumer monitors in a professional environment? And what do we have to pay attention to and consider? Because obviously a lot of people are doing it, but are they doing it in a blind way that's causing them more problems? Or can these things truly be adapted to work in a professional environment the way that pros expect them to use?
I think when it comes to that, it's kind of like Brian was talking about before with the economies of scale, right? With the panels. So some of these broadcast manufacturers are buying the same panels that are actually going into these consumer TVs at some level. And then you have what goes behind the TV. And one of the things that we keep pushing for, I think, as an industry is the ability to turn off some of these like adaptive contrast or light sensors and some of these enhancement features that we don't necessarily want in the grading suite. Some displays let you do that. There are manufacturers that have different SKUs of a display for post-production of a consumer model that might turn off auto dimming, right, to protect the panel from burn-in, where you might not want a consumer, burning in a game score or a CNBC stock ticker, news ticker. So something designed for consumer typically doesn't always have the stuff we want in the pro world, or the features and functionality to be disabled that we want in the pro world. And then we also don't always have the level of optimization we want, right? There's some consumer TVs I've seen some customers buy here in the Hollywood area. They go, hey, I need to master in P3 D65 PQ for Dolby. And we go, well, this TV doesn't have a P3. Like, there's just no P3, and it's a consumer TV. It has BT 2020, it's got BT 709, but there's no P3. And that's not everyone, right? So you really have to find the right display if you're going to go that route that meets the needs of what you're looking for in the grading suite. So those are some of the considerations, I think, on my side. Nate and Bram, you might have some other comments there.
Yeah, this is a huge, and I like the word caveat whenever we're talking about consumer displays, because the unfortunate reality is that there's a lot of them. And we actually, my colleague Timo and I and some folks from Meta and University Academia spoke on this as a panel discussion at the latest Color Imaging Conference a few months back. But it's really tough, especially for wanting to use a lot of these modern panels for like research R&D applications, because something as simple like David was just talking about is getting a clean signal in and out on a TV is not very straightforward. And there's a lot of hurdles you have to go through. He spoke to the plethora of auto enhancement features, true motion, contrast. I mean, even things like power management.
Not to mention, sometimes they'll just decide to reset those settings for you.
100%, and you get into scenarios where it's reset. You do a firmware, things change.
Well, and there's also the insertion of AI into everything, right? Like, the TV is now this all-knowing smart device that can make decisions for you.
Correct. Yeah. So there's a lot. And I wish honestly that we had a playbook of just like, hey, it's almost like a yellow pages where you could like scroll through and be like, okay, this model this year, turn X, blah, 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 blah off. But it's not. We've actually been, hopeful that the idea will come together where there's like some sort of standards group that can push the manufacturers to do what we would I don't know, we would call it something like a scientific mode or something that disables all of these, right?
Right.
But for the reality is like, speaking of scale, like David and Bram have already read, like for 99% of people at home, like they don't need that or they don't want that, right? So
And
it's
that,
kind
I
of
mean,
this
correct me if I'm
balancing
wrong. That was kind of the initial thought behind something like a filmmaker mode, right? Is that it was
Right.
like it would kind of, you know, disable and turn off some of that stuff. But are you saying that like
It's variable though, man. So like filmmaker mode in its inception makes a lot of sense, right? But there's no
standard to it?
no guarantee that
Right.
manufacturer A is going to implement filmmaker mode exactly like manufacturer B does, right? I mean, similar with like HDR10, right, where it's like this open or non-proprietary thing where it's kind of up to the individual OEM to implement how they best see fit, right? So
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is really good in practice, but not executed super well. So when you're getting questions, I mean, we get a ton of questions about consumer TVs, and my whole thing is always just like, just understand, do your research, understand where the caveats are, and work around them if possible.
And that comes down to what we've talked about in all of the any episode we've ever done talking about display. We talk about what is the actual truth. I've been in suites that only have a consumer monitor that, yes, they've gone through and calibrated them and tried to get around all these caveats. I still don't trust it. I will always want at least some level of professional reference monitoring available, whether even if it is to like if I had a gigantic, perfectly calibrated consumer display that measured exactly right, I'd still want some way to verify my signal on an actual instrument, not just this consumer TV, because yeah, an errant firmware update could grenade the whole thing and I would never know.
Yeah.
Well, and that will also then cascade down the stream, right? And that's where my, we always are advocates of like, use the highest quality display possible. Hopefully that means a reference display. But if you have to make, a budget choice or that's not available to you, at the very least, understand the limitations. So, I mean, another good example of this, right, is like a lot of TVs or sort of like these prosumer monitors will have varying like EQ modes, right? So in a colorist world, you guys always want everything hard clipping, right? But some displays might be doing roll-offs
and stuff.
Roll-off behavior 1 is not the same as roll-off behavior 2. And if I make a grading choice why something's rolling off, I have no idea how that's going to permeate downstream when it's getting to like a variety. So you could go down a rabbit hole very quickly with this stuff. So yeah, it's
this
hard.
is where I become a little bit more of an elitist than most colorists.
I'm sure Bram and David would attest to this too. It's like there's not really a good way around it besides just spending time in the lab.
Yeah,
and like learning.
Well, I mean, I think you're on something with the idea of just that a standards body can hopefully more or less dictate to these display manufacturers that like, hey, no, there really should be a cheat code here that we can just turn everything off, right? And
the other side of that coin, though, is
it's never going to happen.
Guess
I
what?
understand.
We have
understand
50 standards. Now we need 51 to make it really perfect.
Yeah. And so a couple of thoughts on that too. So one is that on a lot of these TVs, turning something to off doesn't really turn it to off, but rather low. Most of these TV companies use, chips from MediaTek or other companies like that, there are toggles, they can trigger things, they can label it whatever they want though, right? So something that may be off is really a low setting. The other thing is that you have to remember that these consumer electronics TV manufacturers are not necessarily always incentivized to give you clean in, clean out because they're trying to sell you the advantage of their TV. Their AI makes it, look brighter, or better, or more colorful, or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So those things aren't in there for, by accident. If I think you're barking up the wrong tree if you think you're going to convince the standards bodies to try to enforce this with TV manufacturers, because what you're doing, you're saying, hey, make everything so that regardless of what I buy, it looks the same. Then it just becomes
there's no competitive advantage. I get it. No, I get it. I get it. All right. The very last thing is I want to get your last thoughts on this because this just came in. We had somebody comment on one of our other episodes the other day about this. And David, you had mentioned it kind of offhandedly about color spaces and stuff like that. And that is that one of the things that I think as we move into the world of HDR that is confusing for people about displays is that it used to be everything in our life was Rec 7 and 9, and that's all we were concerned ourselves about. But now we have, on the far end of it, we have 2020, which is, I'll ask some specifics about that in a second, but then we have, P3D65, right? There's P3DCI, like there's all these varying kind of things. And it strikes me that one of the confusing things for a lot of users is we don't know where we sit with this stuff. And 2020 is a great example, right? It's just, I've been hearing about 2020 for a decade plus, right? And it's like, oh yeah, we'll eventually get there. Like, here we are 10, 12 years later, and we're not quite there yet. Like, can you guys speak to some of the challenges, just maybe from each one of your perspectives, of what these wider gamuts and what it really means, and why we're not quite there yet with some of these things, including 2020?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've talked a lot. If anybody else wants to jump in, go ahead. But I have strong thoughts on 2020.
Me too.
Bro.
So I think what's being appreciated more and more by certainly colorists and I think professional post production is that 2020 can be a useful container space, essentially, right? But that it has a lot of caveats when it comes to being an actual target space for displays. This is something I know that the EBU has found quite challenging in terms of where they thought things were going to go. And I think a lot of things were specified early on without recognizing what the knock-on effects may be. I think the good news is that in post-production for content steered towards streaming services, we do have either delivery in P3 and then it gets containerized by those services for distribution out to TVs operating in 2020. Or you have mandates from those services to say, yes, give me something that's 2020, but containerized to P3 with
Limited to P3, yeah.
Exactly, limited to P3. And I think that's great. The biggest issue with 2020 that we see now is in terms of broadcast in 2020, and especially in Europe and with HLG especially, where that limiting to P3 is not happening, and so you get a lot of variable behavior because every display is doing a different percentage of of 2020. And then there's questions about what you do when the targets are outside of 2020. Do you preserve hue towards those target primaries, or do you go max sat, which would be display native? If you go display native, then the problem you have is that it's variable in every single display because every display has different native primaries. And if you do a hue preservation, the problem is that the gamut actually gets a lot smaller than you would think it would be. The other big problem is, even if we had displays that could do all of 2020, and we've seen this in the projector space, and we've seen this now in some of the flat panels getting closer and closer to 2020, is that you probably could not have chosen worse primaries when it comes to the impact to things like observer metamerism, right?
Sure.
So the closer you get, so because the 2020 primaries lie on the spectral locus, you get these narrow, it's basically laser light, 1 nanometer peaks is how it's defined. That causes a lot of observer metamerism, but it's not just the narrowness of it, it's also the location of those. And so you get into issues where the closer and closer we get to 2020, the more and more things look different between observers, and especially anomalous observers. So observers who have, minor sorts of what we would
vision defects or whatever,
color blindness, right? So like anomalous, proto-anomalous. So, and so the more you get to those wide gamut displays, the worse those problems become. And so you see this pullback now where a lot of people in post are starting to say, I kind of wish we had just said P3 and we'll be happy with.
Well, that's the follow up. That's of course the follow up, right? Is that it seems like 2020 is always one goalpost, but we have this perfectly acceptable wider gamut. Because the thing that's always got me about any of these wider gamuts is that most people are not even coming close to extending the boundaries of, any of these wider gamuts, let alone 7 or 9, right? I mean, yes, it's done. I'm thinking the animated films, et cetera, are probably the greatest pushers of that. But when I'm just doing a basic grade, like, honestly, like I look at my vector scope and I'm like, my signal is this on the vector scope, and I'm going, yeah, I don't really have to worry about those boundaries. I mean, I know that's different for everybody, but why didn't we just go, yeah, P3 is the thing?
Well, I think the goal was to obviously have something that was a little bit more future proof.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it was still not using imaginary primaries, like you didn't want to define things as like AP0 or something like that, right? So
yeah, sure.
So you wanted something that could actually be in theory hit, and laser projectors can do this. There are laser projectors that can do this. Those manufacturers typically bring the gamut in a bit to avoid other issues, though. So I still think that the path of least resistance is to say, look, we've had 2020 as a standard for so long. It's going to be way too difficult to go back at this point.
Yeah.
But where I do think there's room, especially for the post-production community, network streamers, all these people, to put pressure on standards bodies like the EBU, like SMPTE, is to get something standardized that, for example, says, yes, we are going to continue to encode things relative to 2020, but let's standardize P3 limiting. Let's not have it be a per network, per
because it's different. Yeah.
Have it be something where maybe there's an EBU spec that says we're going to target 2020 if we're encoding, but we're going to do P3 D65 as the target display space that we're limiting to within. If we do that, we're going to avoid a lot of problems. And until standards bodies do this, our problems as it relates to 2020 are going to get worse and worse, because when I talk to the semiconductor suppliers who are making the panels, they all are actively chasing more and more coverage of 2020 because that's what sells, right? That's
on a spec sheet.
This does 90%, this does 97%. And that's something consumers understand, bigger number better,
Right.
and continue to chase that. And I've had those conversations. I've had people at semiconductor manufacturers tell me, we will not stop chasing that unless you can show us something in writing saying this is no longer necessary. And so I would love for the standards body to say, we're going to limit to P3, because then what we can do is we can focus on making displays that just have native P3 primaries. And that will avoid a lot of these observer metamerism issues. It'll avoid a lot of the other issues.
But still have 2020 signaling for all the work that's been done.
Because at this point it's too late, because
you can.
like David was saying, there's no P3 mode in a lot of these things. They don't know how to decode this stuff. It all is going out as 2020. Even when you deliver to a Netflix as a P3 D65 deliverable,
It's still 2020.
they're doing that as a service, almost to the post-production community to make your
Yeah.
life easy, but it still gets encoded as 2020 and delivered to the home, right? So
I gotcha.
So that's why I think it's too late. The Pandora's box is open, right? So, but we still have this ability to maybe do this. If we don't do that, then the future becomes really tricky in display technology, because the only way we're going to avoid these other problems is go to multi-primary systems, which are prohibitively expensive, especially for you can do it with projection at cost, but you can do it relatively easy. Flat panels, it's really difficult to do at any sort of reasonable cost level. And then you could do things like, again, where you have something non-additive and you have like a broadband white, and that can help with some of these other issues as it comes to anomalous viewers and inter-observer metamerism. But again, you're looking.
But what's the
really
point? Like, you don't get any tangible benefit.
Exactly. It's a really complex problem that we're just creating for ourselves. I think you nailed it, Joey. I think when we had this metamerism experts day in December at the now unfortunately gone MPC, the overwhelming consensus among every colorist, every post supervisor there was, we're happy with P3 D65. Let's just live with that.
Yeah, I gotcha.
And I feel like it's a stupid metric to chase, just like full screen peak brightness. Every so often you'll see that spec. It's a useless spec. Like, nothing ever does full screen white in HDR. It's silly. Nothing is ever going to display full gamut 2020 for any creative reason.
Yeah. Right. All right. So the very last question
I want to see inside out goes to 1,000. Or
very last question is, I want to wrap with David, because David, this has been something that's been on my mind, and you are the experts on this. In fact, have developed software to help this process. There is a large swath of people who go, well, I'm an editor who does color, so I'm not going to invest in a $20,000 reference monitor. I'm going to use my higher end consumer computer monitor to do so, right? And I know one of the challenges that you see with your customers and in your work with Portrait, one of the challenges that you're trying to solve is, hey, how do we get more accurate consumer devices, whether it be laptops, iPads, etc. Can you just kind of wrap things up here for us a little bit with what the challenges of that are, using a computer display, making it accurate, and where tools like patterns come into play to help make those devices as good as they can possibly be given the use case?
Yeah, so it's a huge can of worms that you're opening, right? And and it sort of depends on your platform, right? So Mac OS and Windows have different ways of handling color management. But because these computer systems are typically multi-windowed systems, and each window can have its own format, maybe one's
Sure.
sRGB, maybe one's P3, one's 709. There's a lot of color management that's happening in the image processing. So on a Mac, everything's color managed.
Right.
Whether you set your app up for color management or not, there's color management. And then how the system tries to function is say, what am I connected to? And that creates a ICC color profile through what we call EDID, Extended Display Identification Data. And you need that profile to match what the monitor's doing. This comes back to our conversation earlier where I said, you can have a perfectly calibrated monitor, but if the source isn't set
the
up to
pipe
work
is not
with
right.
that,
Yeah, sure.
it all falls apart, right? So that's where these systems get really complex because with a broadcast monitor like FSI, it's very manual. You can go to your monitor, you can tell it what you want it to be, and typically you're trying to send just a bit accurate signal out of that system to that monitor. With a computer system, there's no like bit accurate mode that's easy to get. On a Mac, everything goes through color management, whether you want it to or not. And on Windows, you have what we call color aware or non-color aware apps. So if it's color aware, it'll go through a color management pipeline. If it's not color aware, it'll come out. But you still have some of the processing that might happen from that GPU, right? Like an NVIDIA GPU, AMD, Intel, et cetera. They have their own controls and they might be adding their own flavor. So you still have some adjustments that might be happening on that output that's going to that display. So to really get what you're asking for, which is, can I connect, a monitor directly to my Mac or my Windows machine and then start grading? It's not something I personally recommend because of the can of worms, right? As you start to test the system, you start to see, oh, there's a gotcha here, there's a gotcha there. There are instances where you can make it right, where you can take a Windows machine and say, okay, in this instance, if I'm grading for X, this is now set up properly, I can do it. And the same thing on Mac OS. You can say, for this instance, I'm grading properly. Where it falls apart, though, is when you're switching formats. Maybe you're going to HDR, maybe you're going back to SDR, maybe you're going from 709 to working on something in Adobe RGB for print. And so then that's where it starts to fall apart, where you can't easily switch and make sure you're always in that perfect thing. So my recommendation for customers and for people in the creative community is I still recommend using a reference monitor. I still recommend coming out of a card that's going to give you an accurate output like an AGA or a Blackmagic card or similar. The apps talk to that card directly. They bypass the color management system. These developers we trust, like Resolve and Baselight and these companies, we trust that they're sending bit accuracy to these cards. It's coming out to the monitor. We can trust that what we're getting is what we're sending, and we don't have that. But I do think this is a hot topic. It's been a hot topic for a long time. I do think we're going to start to see organizations like Apple, like Microsoft, et cetera, continue to improve their color management system, right? I think there will be a day where we get to a point where we say we can plug in a computer monitor and turn on, maybe it's a creator's mode, right? Or a reference mode, like you have on your iPad, right? You have reference mode on your iPad and say, okay, now this output is coming bit accurate and there's no adjustments happening. Because even if you get a specific, like on your Mac, if you get your Mac plugged in and you forget to turn off your True Tone because you happen to have a Mac with True Tone, it's still applying that True Tone to that signal sometimes. So just a lot of gotchas and a lot of stuff you have to make is perfect. So I've worked with a number of studios where we have made it work. We have been able to get really accurate images for their workflows, but it's often not worth the extra effort because the cards are now so affordable. Right, you look at some of the cards from Blackmagic, a couple $100. Go ahead.
Can you speak to what Patterns does that's unique compared to, for example, just using like a generic TPG window that does like red, green, blue colors? Like why does Patterns work better in that scenario?
Okay, yeah. So a friend of mine, my friend Eric, and now Portrait Displays owns it, but we worked on an app called Patterns. It's on Mac OS and iOS. And one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to understand what was happening with the color management. So we built in the ability to use Apple Color Management on the pattern window. So if you've looked at computer test pattern generators, I think until now, I don't know any of them that are sophisticated in that way, where you can go to the menu and say, this is a 70924. And then it tells the OS, this is a 70924 test pattern, process it as such. Then I can set my, let's say, CalMan to 70924 and measure off the front of the screen and say, am I getting what this actually is? It can do HDR as well on the Mac. So it can do HDR, so you can actually measure in high dynamic range for BT 2020 or P3 and see what is my EOTF doing? Is it tone mapping? Is it following the curve? So it really allowed us to start to see what was happening with some of these things within the processing pipeline and where things were happening with color management and how we might get around them.
Well, guys, this has been very illuminating information. I know that we have a ton more questions and thoughts about this, but we'll save that for another day. We'll do a follow-up at a later date. For any of our viewers watching, all three of these guys, whether they'll admit it to it or not, are excellent tutorialists, right? And they have very, very good videos on the internet. If you want to go over to flandersscientific.com and check out some of the video resources there, the Brahms metamerism video is like it's gold. That video, like I've shared that with more people. More people than I know, because it really explains a lot of that, some of those display challenges that we see. Nate as well, with all the Dolby training that he has helped design and push forward to the consumer. It's worth noting that if you are interested in Dolby Vision, you can become Dolby Vision certified, which is sort of a combination of some testing and kind of traditional test kind of stuff, but also with a do it component of having to kind of show how that you grasp how this stuff works. And then also worth the watch is to head over to the Portrait Displays YouTube channel, where David handles a lot of tutorial videos about calibrating specific displays, talks more about patterns as well. All three of these places are fantastic resources for deeper dives on some of these challenging issues that we've spoken about over these past few episodes when it comes to displays. So guys, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with us. We're sorry that the viewer doesn't know this, but we've recorded for about 11 and a half hours here today. So we have plenty of content that we'll get out to everybody there. But guys, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we'll have to do this again sometime soon. Really, really, really big, heartfelt thanks. So for the Offset Podcast, I am Robbie Carmen.
And I'm Joey Diana. Thanks for listening.